Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and the executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Leslie Stainton, who's here to discuss her book, Lorca, A Dream of Life. What an interesting book. As you know, we've not done biographies on our programs, but this one we just couldn't not do. Everyone calls Lorca Spain's greatest poet, but you've also brought a lot to the study of his life, and maybe you can share with us some of those elements here, like the new archival material, letters.
Well, it was, I set out on this project knowing, as you said, that he is considered by many to be Spain's greatest poet, certainly the greatest poet of the 20th century, and I would say most regard him as sort of the second best-known Spanish writer after Cervantes. So it was a daunting project to take it on. It was funny, it was almost a schizophrenic experience, because when I lived and worked in Spain, people would say to me, why do you want to do Lorca? And over in the United States, people would say, Lorca? So from the start, I had to deal with that, the fact that he's incredibly well-known in Spain and not particularly well-known except among academic and poetry and theater circles in the United States. It was also daunting because my Spanish was hesitant at best when I went over to Spain in 1984, and I had to spend a great deal of time just getting my teeth into that language, learning how to, all the customs, dealing with the language, that sort of thing, never mind conducting interviews with people in this strange language and all of that. So it took me quite a long time to get to know the country, learn where the archives were, get to know the family, which was the key to most of the archives, and foster or get good relationships with many of the great lorquistas who were working in the vineyard, as one of them used to say to me. And so it was actually through one of those lorquistas that I came upon a cache of letters that Lorca had written to his family over the course of his lifetime, many of them from his adolescence, which were particularly fascinating because there's still so little known about that period of his life, and it was such a formative, incredible period when so many things were taking shape in his mind and his heart. Those letters didn't emerge or appear until I had been working on the project probably a dozen years. So that was quite a revelation when they first surfaced. And they informed much of the book and allowed me to do what my predecessors hadn't done, which was to really get inside his mind, particularly in those early years, but also later on, in the later years of his life when he was very, very famous. And I think this is probably a problem that many biographers face. When the subject becomes so famous and so public, it's very difficult to get inside the subject's mind and know what they were thinking, he or she was thinking on a more intimate basis. So again, those letters allowed me to get into that part of Lorca.
Yeah, and there was this growth that he had from who he was as a child and a young student, and then who he became.
He started out, I mean, he was a prodigy, that was clear. Although he was a terrible student, so it's a great example for anybody who's a lousy student but dreams of being a poet or an artist, because he was exactly that. Lazy, desultory, and so on. But he had this genius inside of him, this incredible ability with not only words but music and images. He was a terrific draftsman and a marvelous pianist, and actually his first love was music, and he wanted to be a pianist from the time he was probably 14, 15 years old. But when he turned 17, 18, his father would not allow him to pursue his piano studies in Paris as Lorca wanted. And so in the rather funny autobiographical note that Lorca wrote many years later, he said, and he talked about himself in the third person, he said he took his pathetic creative zeal, that zeal for music, and turned it toward literature. And he much later said that he was never able to say in literature what he could have said in music. So music in many ways informed what he did as a writer. He was constantly, I think throughout his life, but particularly so in those early years, trying to approach the condition of music through words, which is a not always easy endeavor. so a lot of his artistic evolution was a process of learning how to do that and learning how to take the other arts, particularly visual art and music, and somehow incorporate those in a seamless way into his writing. He did it very clumsily in his early years, but as he evolved as an artist, he learned how to do that. The other, I suppose, great evolution that he went through was on a personal front. As an adolescent, he had a fairly tortured period of puberty, I think it's fair to say. He called it a crucible, and during which he tried again and again to convince himself that he was conventional, that he was in love with women, when in fact he wasn't attracted to them, and in fact found them quite repulsive in many ways, their physical attributes. And over the course of the years, well into his 20s, gradually came to grips with the fact that he was a homosexual, and ultimately was able to embrace and celebrate that. But it was a long and very difficult process for him.
Well, at one point in your prologue, you talk about him seeing himself as a 20th century Don Quixote,
Tilting at
consumed
windmills.
by insatiable passions, and that seemed to be one of the elements of his existence, is this enormous power, but the struggle to deal with all the elements of it through his life and how he could articulate that into form.
Well, those are, the words you quoted are his words exactly, and they were written by, I can't remember the exact age, but we're talking 18 or 19 years old, so you need to place that quote in that context. He was an exuberant adolescent saying this about himself. But I think it also holds true. One of the things I admire most about him and find most inspirational, and I think continue to challenge and motivate me as I worked on the book over the course of many years, was that idealism that is characteristic of Don Quixote, and his constant challenging of accepted convention, be it social, artistic, emotional, you name it. Lorca, in his writing, in his speeches, in his letters, in his everyday conversation to people, was constantly challenging people to go beyond what was accepted, to get rid of the orthodox. He was, his father was quite wealthy, a bourgeois landowner in rural Andalusia, and Lorca, who was quite close to his family throughout his life, nevertheless railed against the bourgeoisie in his works and poked fun at them and at their penchant for kitsch and that sort of thing. So I think in that sense he remains a Don Quixote till this day, because I think the things with which he challenged his contemporaries remain every bit as viable and true today to us.
What I thought was fascinating is that throughout his life, he would make these connections with all kinds of people who then helped inform his life and give him training and experiences, from the teacher that took him on the different expeditions.
He was, there's one article out there somewhere in the abundance of Lorca scholarship by a woman who talks about different phases in Lorca's life, and she names them by the names of his mentors. In his early days, it was a teacher first who took him on a tour of Spain, and it was during that tour, extended tours of Spain, as a university student, that he began to write. He was forced to write as part of that tour. He had to keep a diary of what he did. But it was that turned him into a writer. Then, a couple of years later, he met up with Manuel de Falla, the great Andalusian composer, and that was a tremendously influential period in his life, when he really went back to his early musical roots, and particularly his roots growing up in a Spanish village and hearing servants and his own father play and sing popular Spanish songs at night, and Lorca knew them by the hundreds. And just as Falla did, learned to incorporate them in his work. But during this couple of year period when he was very close with Falla, they actually collaborated on a festival of cantejondo, or deep songs. Sometimes it's referred to as flamenco, although Lorca and Falla disdained that term. He also collaborated with Falla on a play, which it was supposed to be an operetta. It never truly came to pass. Falla was a much more diligent and methodical and workaholic person than Lorca was, and finally they had to split because Falla simply couldn't put up with Lorca's ways. He then went on and had a very passionate, both emotionally, probably physically and certainly artistically passionate relationship with Salvador Dali, who was actually his contemporary. So in that sense, it wasn't so much a mentor relationship. He kind of emerged, as we all do, from that need to be mentored by someone older and entered into this relationship with one of his peers. But again, he was tremendously influenced by Dali and influenced Dali during that period. It was definitely a two-way street. Later on, I guess he kind of found his own feet after a while and was a little bit less influenced by people. He certainly forged important friendships with people like Pablo Neruda, but at that point they really had established each had established his own voice and was far less able to be influenced by the other. But friendships were tremendously important to Lorca. And part of that, at the risk of going on ad nauseum, was in Spanish society, there's a thing called a tertulia, where people get together at night in what's called a tertulia gathering, an informal gathering of artists, writers. It could be bullfighters, it could be generals in the army. They all sort of gathered all over Madrid and got together on a nightly basis and talked and exchanged poems and exchanged ideas. And that's a very, very lively tradition in Spain. So to some extent, the tradition itself in Spain contributed to that notion of friendship being an important part of Lorca's artistic evolution.
It's obvious that why your book's attracting so much attention. There's been the scholarship for the 14 years, but how did you find these archives?
Luck.
Yes.
I was at the right place in the right time.
Imagine.
Well, it's funny, the really, probably the most major find, I mean, there were a lot of little things that were wonderful discoveries when I made them and will probably be of great interest to only a few people in the world who know that those things hadn't been discovered before. But they get buried in the text, and any scholar will know what I'm talking about. But they get lost on the everyday reader. The cache of letters that I referred to earlier was something that was rumored to exist. It all had to do with the Civil War and the fact that the Lorca family fled Spain after, well, I shouldn't say fled, but they left Spain after the war and went to the United States for a number of years. And as I understand it, left their country home outside Granada in the hands of family members, cousins. And I was told at one point during my work that it was very possible that one such cousin, who was at this point rather elderly and has since died, might have a cache of letters. So I went and talked to him. I talked to his son. The son said, well, I don't know anything about what the father has. You better go talk to the father. Went to the father. He was a lovely old man. We walked through the streets of Granada. He told me things, this and that. I asked him about letters. He very candidly, innocently to me, seemingly to me, said, no, I don't know anything about it, this and that. And to this day, I don't know whether he knew or not. What I do know is that a couple of years later he died. And suddenly this trunk materializes that was, I guess, in the family attic or something for years. So several years later, this man died, and suddenly this trunk of letters materialized in the attic, I presume, of the family home. And a friend of mine who has for many years been the editor of Lorca's correspondence and was tremendously helpful to me throughout my work on the project, let me know that these letters exist. And I met up with him. He was teaching at Harvard at the time. I met up with him. There was, I mean, it wasn't surreptitious, but it almost felt like a drug exchange or something. You know, he hands me this packet of Xerox letters. I haul them back to Ann Arbor. I remember standing in a Kinko's in Ann Arbor, Xeroxing these letters, thinking to myself, what on earth would Lorca think if he knew that 60 years after writing these adolescent letters, when he had no concept that he would ever be famous, somebody would be standing in Ann Arbor, Michigan, madly photocopying these treasures for her book. But in any case, that's what happened. And the letters have now been published as part of Lorca's complete correspondence in Spain, in Spanish, but have not appeared in English. And I'm not sure they will, although they are because there are probably too many of them to warrant publication here, but it is a marvelous selection of work and just beautiful, beautiful writing. The other thing I did come across, and again it was partly thanks to this colleague, scholar, were letters written to Lorca by friends over the course of his lifetime. And then later on, as I worked on, during the course of my work on the book, the Lorca archive itself evolved from a sort of stash of stuff in the attic of Lorca's nephew to a properly functioning archive with archival workers, assistants, and librarians, and normal hours, that sort of thing. So as that archive became more accessible, I was also able to go in and look at things there that had not been published before.
I found it interesting that he's not only well known as a poet, but as you point out in your book throughout, he was also interested in the theater and in playwriting, and that was a significant part of his literary production.
Well, that's where I feel, in some ways, I don't want to say I have the most to bring to it, but that's certainly one of the strengths I bring to the book, because my background is in theater, so that's how I came across him. I think many people know him chiefly through his poetry. He himself, and I can't emphasize this enough, wanted to be a playwright all his life. That was his great dream. And he started out early on writing poems, plays, and some prose simultaneously. He eventually ditched the prose, which was really not his strength, and went on to both poems and plays. He sort of hit his stride as a poet much earlier than he did as a playwright. It took him a long time to learn one of the chief lessons there is to learn about the theater, which is that the medium of plays is not words but actors. And in his early work, he dwelt almost exclusively on words, and they were very symbolic, romantic, kind of goofy, funny plays to read now. His very first play was about a love affair between a cockroach and a butterfly, if you get the idea. Yeah. And I love the anecdote that during the opening night of the play, it bombed completely. One audience member screamed out over the crowd for insecticide. Poor Lorca's down in the bowels of the theater listening to this stuff. But he, later on in his life, in his 30s, his great fame as a playwright coincided with the flourishing of the Spanish Republic, which was a great, albeit short-lived period of liberalism in Spain in the early 20th century. And during that time, Lorca was asked to head a student theater company, and he took plays, classic Spanish plays, not his own work. He refused to promote his own work in that way, which I respect him for immensely. But he took these plays around Spain, and somebody at one point, a reporter, asked him, "Aren't you giving up your own poetry? Aren't you sacrificing your own poetry in order to do this theater work?" And Lorca said, "Oh no," he said, "I'm doing the poetry of the Spanish classics. We're doing even greater poetry by doing this." So it was not a sidelight or a sideshow for him to do theater. It was truly the way he felt he could best reach out and touch, to use a cliche, the Spanish people. And that was a great goal in his life, was to restore what he felt were roots that he had severed by growing up, moving to the city as his family made him do in his adolescence, going to college, becoming a famous bourgeois playwright. He wanted to restore his roots with the people of Spain, and by that he meant the people of the countryside. And so when he wrote plays that people from the countryside understood, when he took plays out on the road to people in the country, in rural villages, he felt that he was recreating that bond that he had severed in his youth, and that caused him great angst when he severed it.
And he seemed to have this position as an intellectual in the public space, and that this playwriting, and particularly that one play, The Blood Wedding, which evoked the Irish playwright.
John Millington Synge.
Yeah.
He's best known for his tragedies, of which Blood Wedding is the first. He wrote a trilogy of tragedies. He called them Tragedies of the Spanish Land. When he wrote them, they're not the only thing he wrote by any stretch of the imagination. It's almost unfortunate that that's what he's become best known for, because it pigeonholes him in a place where he really doesn't belong. He also wrote wildly experimental works that many people have called surreal, but in fact are more accurately expressionist. And they're wonderful plays and very resonant today. In fact, perhaps more so than the more conventional tragedies that he wrote. When he wrote the tragedies, he wanted to, in some ways, recreate the Spanish Golden Age. He felt that quite rightly, he felt that was an age when Spain had been in its glory, and the writers had flourished, and Spain had contributed as never before and never since to world drama, and he wanted to do the same. He also felt that the drama's roots lay in tragedy. Actually, he felt they lay both in tragedy and in the puppet theater. And those were two directions his own work went in. He also wrote farces and puppet plays. But the tragedies, by writing tragedies, he felt that he was going back to the ancient origins, not only of the Spanish theater, but of theater itself, of course.
There's an interesting thing I noticed throughout the book of this vividness of the language. He just had this...
Lorca's language.
Lorca's language. He really worked on that.
It was, I have to say, my early drafts of the book, and there were many, and I wouldn't want anybody to see most of them, were as florid, more florid, because Lorca was pretty good at it by the time he hit his stride. But I wrote with this very florid language, romantic, symbolic, trying in some metaphorical, densely imagistic, trying in some ways to emulate Lorca and to tell his story, and I guess through his words. I'm not sure what I was aiming for. And a friend and fellow biographer read parts of the manuscript for me early on and said, you know, Leslie, his stuff is so vivid and so effervescent and florid in some ways that you've got to tone your style down a lot, which is what I finally did. But he was an exuberant human being given to exuberant, sometimes excessive language. Again, earlier in his life, it was way over the top. He eventually learned to tone it down. He actually, it was a very interesting process that he went through, because if you look at his first book of poems, which is called Book of Poems, some of those poems are quite strong, but there are a number of poems in there that are highly romantic. He was working in a style called modernismo, Hispanic modernism, which is very florid. Rubén Darío invented the style, and Lorca was doing his best to copy him. Lots of just high-blown phrases. He then went on almost immediately, suddenly, learned how to strip his language down, and he got a lot of that from Spanish popular song and from gypsy song, which is stripped of ornament, densely metaphorical, and Lorca began using this. It also is not unlike haiku, which was popular in Madrid at that time, and Lorca immediately picked up on that. He had a tremendous facility for absorbing whatever was around him and immediately putting it to use in his work. He was actually a kind of terrible reader, but he could hear somebody talk about a book on a show like this, I suppose, had they existed, and seize what he needed from that and put it into his own work. So he began writing almost immediately after the publication of this uneven first book, these marvelous poems, suites, deep song poems, and a collection he later called Songs, which are just rich with images, pared down language, beautiful stuff. And at that point, he was in his early 20s, which is almost a miracle, I think.
You talked a little bit about his untimely death, and I think that's actually quite interesting because it was another example of where he was both drawn into and pursued, into this elements of political dynamics that then ended in his death.
Yeah, it's one of the terrible moments in 20th century history, and as his good friend Pablo Neruda said a year after Lorca's death, we can never forget this crime. We can never forgive it. Never, never, never. And if nothing else, I hope my book helps fulfill what Neruda said when he said that. Lorca was killed, he was murdered in the first month of the Spanish Civil War by nationalist partisans. He was not political, despite what some have said. He was certainly caught up in the spirit of the times, and they were very contentious times, and he was very much a liberal. There was no question about that. He had socialist, communist friends, but he made a great point during that period of his time, and we're talking the years roughly 1933 through 36, or 31, 36 was the Spanish Republic, and the last years of that republic were horrifically volatile in Spain with lots of deaths. And lots of fighting and all kinds of anarchy on the streets. And Lorca certainly got caught up in it, as did everybody else, but his concern throughout his life was social justice. So it's particularly heartbreaking that he got caught up in this as he did. The war, the final events leading to the outbreak of war took place in July 1936, when one of the leading conservative politicians in Spain was murdered. Lorca freaked out, as did many other people, and said to a friend, he decided immediately to go to Granada, his family's home, where he thought he would be safe. And it was a fairly safe bet, I guess. Who would have guessed that the capital, where violent things were happening on a daily basis, would in fact turn out to be a liberal bastion for a few more years? And that Granada, which was in the more or less quiet countryside of southern Spain, would become a nationalist stronghold within a matter of a week of Lorca's return home. But that's what happened. The war broke out on July 18th, coincidentally Lorca's Saint's Day. I mean, the resonances are incredible. And within a month, Lorca realized he was in danger because he was an outspoken liberal. I mean, it was just clear. At that point, the nationalists took over and immediately, in Granada, and immediately began rounding up known liberals and shooting them. And I think something like 2,000 people were killed in the first couple of months. So you didn't have to do much to get killed. I mean, all you had to do was have a friend, an acquaintance, an enemy, somebody denounce you, and that's presumably what happened to him. And he was picked up in the middle of the night, and actually picked up in broad daylight, arrested, held for a day or two. It's not completely clear how long. And then with 5 other people driven out in the middle of the night and shot on the side of a road. And his body's never been found. It was a ravine where hundreds of bodies were dumped. It was many, many, many decades, many, many years, several decades before anybody even knew exactly where he'd been shot. And the specifics surrounding that death are still a mystery, but it is a horrific crime.
It seemed as though the family didn't even know right away what had happened.
They didn't. I mean, who would have known in those days? You know, rumors were coming and going. His brother-in-law, in fact, was murdered the day he was arrested. So his poor sister was dealing in that week with the death of her husband and the death of her brother. And word slowly trickled out to the world press. But by September, I believe by September, there were reports in the American papers that Lorca had been killed. I mean, he was very well known. That's the other incredible part of it, is that he was famous. And the brazenness of people to snatch up. You would have thought that he might have been safe because of his fame. As it is, there's no silver lining to it. The only thing that can be said is that because of his fame, I guess he has become the great martyr of that war. And
well, this has been a very interesting biography. It really caught our attention, and thank you for being on the program.
thank you very much.
Okay.